Welcome to meeting number 32 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on National Defence. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, September 16, 2025, the committee is meeting to study the situation of Francophones and Indigenous peoples in the Canadian Armed Forces. Today's meeting is taking place in hybrid format. So before we continue, we ask participants to consult the guidelines on the table. And these measures are here to help prevent audio and feedback incidences and to protect the health and safety of our interpreters. I'd like to remind witnesses and members, please wait until I recognize you by name. And before speaking, the clerk and I will manage a speaking order as best we can. And for interpretation, you can use your earpiece and select the appropriate channel, either floor, English, or French. It's also available on Zoom for our witnesses participating virtually. I'd now like to welcome our witnesses. We have Stephanie Schwanner, Associate Professor. I believe Hélène Le Sécurier, the retired captain, is also available. Yes, you're on. Perfect. Lieutenant Governor General, my apologies. Michelle Maisonneuve, I'm not sure if she's on as of yet. Oh, Michelle Maisonneuve, there you are. Welcome. And Eric Sauvé. I will now open it up to the witnesses to provide their opening remarks. Stephanie, why don't we start with you?
Merci, Monsieur le Président, chers membres du comité.
Thank you, Chair. Members of the committee, thank you for the invitation. This is my first appearance before the National Defence Committee, so I'll introduce myself. I've been a professor of political science at the Royal Military College in Kingston since 2017, and I'm also affiliated with Queen's University in the Canadian Forces College in Toronto. My research focuses on the constitutional, legislative, and political aspects of Canada's language regime, rights of linguistic minorities, and Indigenous peoples. I'm here in my personal capacity as a researcher, and my remarks don't represent the official position of the Royal Military College. I listened to the testimony of the witnesses who've already appeared before you as part of your study, and I'd like to add my 2 cents on the issue of official languages within the broader context. The change that is needed, in my view, is simply for all members of the CAF to embrace official languages. Official languages and bilingualism remain largely the concern of Francophones at the moment. One point I think is important to highlight is the difference between the representation of Francophones within the armed forces and the representation of the Francophone community and official languages within the Canadian Armed Forces. As you know, Francophones are overrepresented in the armed forces relative to their share of the national population. However, the CAF is unable to fill all positions where French is a language of work with individuals who are proficient in the language. It's also noted that many members of the forces operate primarily in an English-speaking environment and rarely have the opportunity to work in French, leading to persistent unilingualism among Anglophones. Only 9% are bilingual, and for the 59% of Francophone members who are bilingual, to a phenomenon of subtractive bilingualism. What is meant by subtractive bilingualism is that continuous exposure to an English-dominated work environment causes Francophones serving in the armed forces to assimilate into English to the point where it can become difficult for them to work in French, even when it is possible to do so. Nor do they always have access to the services to which they're entitled in the official language of their choice, and depending on their rank in the military hierarchy, requesting such services may be perceived as insubordination. A study by the Office of the Director General, Research and Analysis also showed that bilingualism rests largely on the shoulders of Francophones, even though fewer than half of them say they feel comfortable using the official language of their choice during work meetings, and fewer than 2/3 say they feel comfortable using their language with their immediate supervisors. Measures to support the recruitment of Francophones, particularly in the Navy, which lacks a natural recruitment pool among this population, will be beneficial. However, a cultural shift regarding what it means to respect and promote official languages within the CAF is also necessary. This translates not only into greater use of French, but also into increased opportunities for English-speaking members to learn French early and use it consistently throughout their careers. The new ministerial directive on the modernization of the Official Languages Act appears to be moving in this direction. But we must monitor the progress of its implementation to ensure that the new objectives are effectively met. Furthermore, support for learning the other official language should not be limited to preparing to pass the test to obtain BVB or CCBC ratings, but should focus on actually being able to interact with colleagues in the other official language. This is a type of learning that takes place throughout a career and should begin as soon as a member joins the forces. If we make bilingualism and linguistic duality a matter of respect and leadership, if all members of the forces feel they have an equal opportunity to learn and use their official language throughout their careers, we'll create a virtuous cycle that will enhance operational capability and cohesion and prevent resentment toward bilingualism. This increased proficiency in both official languages will, moreover, be useful not only on our bases and during our domestic operations. In the current geopolitical context where Canada is seeking to diversify its alliances, the presence within our forces of a strong contingent of soldiers capable of working in French is also an added value that will enable close collaboration with NATO member countries and also have French as an official language. Thank you. Thank you very much. And
5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Mesdames et Messieurs les membres du
thank you,
comité.
Chair. Ladies and gentlemen of the committee, serving one's country should never mean having to choose between one's career and one's rights, between one's health and one's language, or between one's identity and one's sense of belonging, and yet that is exactly what I had to do. I served for over 20 years in the Canadian Armed Forces with loyalty, discipline, and dedication. But as a Francophone and a member of First Nation, my institutional experience has been marked by systemic barriers that can no longer be ignored. Today, I'd like to present 3 concrete examples of these obstacles. First, training. When I became an officer, I was required to complete a mandatory university program offered exclusively in English. No support was provided for Francophones, no accommodations, no recognition of the fact that we had to perform, succeed, and be evaluated in a second language within a demanding academic context. When I raised the issue with my chain of command, I was told I could file a complaint, but at the cost of delaying my career. In other words, assert my rights or move forward. I chose to continue in English, as many Francophones do, but adapting isn't the same as being included. And this experience reveals a troubling reality. Access to career training is not equitable in both official languages, and it is Francophones who bear the cost. Second, access to services. Upon my return from Afghanistan, I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Shortly after, I was transferred to Ottawa. In this highly vulnerable situation, I had to receive care in English, not by choice, but due to a lack of any real alternative. Services in French existed in theory, but not within a time frame compatible with my condition. Expressing trauma in a second language means losing nuance, words, and sometimes even the meaning of what you're trying to say. In practical terms, it means receiving only half the care you need. The choice I was given was simple: receive inadequate care or wait indefinitely. That is not equitable access. It is a systemic barrier. Third, the institutional experience. Within health services, I myself participated in the analysis of language profiles. I saw firsthand how the requirements differed. Francophones were required to be fully bilingual to advance. This requirement was not applied with the same rigor to Anglophones. Promotions were granted despite incomplete language profiles, but rarely, if ever, to the benefit of Francophones. This creates a silent but persistent reality, a structural inequality in career trajectories. Added to this is a deeper dimension. I am a member of the Pequot-Kamiunuach community. Throughout my career, I've never put this identity forward, not out of a lack of pride, but out of clarity. Because I was already a woman, already a Francophone, already in the military. Adding my Indigenous identity would have meant exposing myself even more in an environment where denigration, prejudice, and intimidation were part of daily life. So I chose silence. And when an institution pushes its members to silence themselves to silence a part of themselves rather, in order to succeed, it's not an individual problem, it's an institutional problem. Today, we talk about inclusion. But inclusion isn't measured solely by what's written in policies. It is measured by what members actually experience, and my experience highlights a clear gap. The principles exist, but their implementation remains uneven. I leave you with 3 recommendations. Make it mandatory to offer all career training in both official languages, without exception, before its rollout, and suspend any training that does not comply. Ensure immediate access to health services, particularly mental health services in the official language of choice, including priority referral mechanisms when these services are not available locally. Make promotions contingent on the equitable application of language requirements for all, and publish annual comparative data on the career trajectories of Francophones and Anglophones. Because serving one's country should never mean having to translate oneself, remain silent, or change oneself in order to be recognized. Thank you. Thank you.
General Maisonneuve, over to you for 5 minutes.
Mesdames et Messieurs, les ordres. Notre mission aujourd'hui est de prendre d'assaut la colline 12-21 en contournant l'ennemi par la droite. Le 12e régiment blindé prendra la tête jusqu'à l'objectif. I ask the interpreters not to translate the mission above to make a point. If you didn't understand the orders, you will find it very hard to attack the objective you were given without endangering lives. Merci pour votre invitation à témoigner devant vous.
Thank you for inviting me to testify before you. I fully support your efforts to examine the situation of Francophones in the Canadian Forces, which has 2 official languages.
Experience with bilingualism. My family moved from Saint-Jérôme in Quebec to Prince Albert, Saskatchewan in the summer of 1967 when I was 14 years old. I went from grade 8 in a French school to grade 9 in English. It was very difficult. I was fortunate to retain my French language, and in my 35 years of service in uniform, saw me serving both English and French-speaking units. I've commanded troops of both. I've served across Canada and outside the country on different missions and postings. I commanded French conscripts for 2 years while serving in France. I believe I have the reputation of being a defender of bilingualism as recognized by the Vimy Award in 2020. I've made it my crusade in my whole career to promote and always use both languages in whatever scenario when speaking publicly. I've also tried to make all my Anglophone friends and colleagues understand the importance of saying a few words of French when they address any gathering. More on that later. Secondly, as you can imagine from the importance of understanding the operational orders I gave at the beginning, I believe bilingualism is an essential part of leadership within the Canadian Armed Forces. Our young men and women who agree to serve their country deserve leaders who can communicate with them in either official language. Mon cours d'officier de l'arme blindée en 1974 était donné entièrement en anglais. De nos jours, les forces canadiennes ont fait...
My Armored Corps officer course in 1974 was conducted entirely in English. Today, there has been significant progress, and the vast majority of specialty courses are available in both official languages. When I left the military in 2007, senior officers and senior non-commissioned officers were required to achieve a functional level of bilingualism before being promoted, and I believe this is still the case. Nevertheless, some still question the need for this.
Well known, and just like any other requirement for promotion, if the individual did not make an effort to become proficient in their second language, they do not deserve to be promoted. It's part of simple meritocracy, just like the results on a career course. Learning a language as an adult is tough. In the military, opportunities are made available, and we obviously need more to learn your second language throughout your career. Many complain, but the policy is clear. And if those who complain would spend as much time doing their best to learn their second language, they might achieve the standard. Bilingualism in the Canadian Armed Forces is a leadership issue, and bilingualism definitely provides our military with an operational advantage. Finally, let me go beyond the military. Notre pays compte 2 langues officielles. Ceci fait partie de notre...
Our country has 2 official languages. This is part of our identity as a country. We are not a post-national country without a culture. We should celebrate this fact of official bilingualism. This aspect of our country sets us apart from many other countries and gives us a competitive advantage.
As a country, the best defenders of bilingualism are Anglophones. If a Francophone defends the French language, it's seen as normal behavior. An Anglophone defending the French language will have a much greater impact. Bilingualism is part of respect. Just as many believe we should perform land acknowledgments, In any forum, we should acknowledge the bilingual nature of our country. As I've said many times, any Anglophone can say, Je m'excuse de ne pas pouvoir parler français, donc mes
I
remarques.
apologize for not being able to speak French, so my remarks will be in English. For example, I was completely astonished by the appointment of a Governor General who was unable to speak French. I find it incredible that Miss Simon, who has a long career in public service, could have reached the level of ambassador for Canada without being able to speak our two official languages. I found the appointment disrespectful, but I was willing to give her time to learn. We now know that she was unable or unwilling to do so.
Provides another interesting case study. Indeed, you can live without any trouble in Montreal without speaking French, but why would you want to? My problem with Mr. Rousseau is that after his speech 5 years ago, he committed to learning French. He either lied or did not put in the work as promised. In my view, this is a failure of ethics and leadership, not only of French language ability. In conclusion, I reiterate my belief that bilingualism is a military leadership respect issue and national competitive advantage for our country. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, très bien.
Thank
Lieutenant
you.
John, your points, which were well made to this committee. Well done. Monsieur Sauvé, over to you for 5 minutes.
Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs les membres.
Chair, members of the committee, I served as an officer in the Canadian Forces from the age of 16 to 39. When I retired in 2014, I went on a round-the-world trip with my children. We visited 21 countries in 1 year. In every country we visited, I asked them to learn 2 words in the local language, hello and thank you. In Brazil, it was bom dia and obrigado. In Laos, sabaidi and kopchai. They knew nothing more in Portuguese or Lao, but saying a few words in the language of the person you're speaking with is the bare minimum of respect. I worked for months, even years, for English-speaking superiors who never once said hello or thank you, Eric, in French to me. Never. I saw an Army Chief of Staff present his vision for the future of hundreds of officers and non-commissioned officers without even bothering to say good morning in French at the start. Orders come from the top, so does the example, and organizational culture depends on its top leaders. Before coming here to testify, I put out a call on social media. I didn't want to speak only for myself, but for the many Francophones who serve or have served. I asked them not to tell me about their problems, but to suggest solutions. Their testimony confirmed this to me. For national defense, the recognition of language rights is a case of double standards. Very little is expected of an Anglophone when it comes to French, but there's a complacent assumption that a Francophone will manage just fine in English, as if learning a second language were natural for one group and too demanding for the other. We're facing a cultural problem. A notoriously difficult problem to solve, I agree. It will take time, but above all, it will take political will. You have a very real lever, the law. Military personnel are by nature conservative and resistant to change, but they do obey orders, and your laws become orders. If you require a certain level of bilingualism to be achieved in order to qualify for command positions, they will achieve that. If you require that all training courses be offered in both official languages, it will be done. If you impose quotas, they will be met. Because your laws are orders, and orders are carried out. But legislation alone is not enough. We must also provide the means to enforce these laws. Clear guidelines, dedicated budgets, deadlines to be met, and above all, training on a large scale. Allow me to draw a military parallel. You don't hand a soldier a weapon and expect him to spontaneously become a competent marksman. To ensure he's confident in his ability, you train him regularly. That is the only way to make him competent and confident. I have never met a soldier who liked to appear incompetent. If they have to use a weapon, a technique, or a language, soldiers want to master it first. Otherwise, out of fear of failure and ridicule, they will refrain from using it. It's exactly the same with a second language. Asking a soldier to speak in a language they rarely use will have little effect. without the resources there to learn, train, and practice regularly. We wouldn't expect a soldier whose first aid training dates back 3 or 4 years to be effective in an emergency. The same applies to the use of a second language. It must be required that it be taught starting in basic training. Then ongoing training must be provided throughout their career, and real opportunities to use it must be created in briefings, in classes, in assessments, and during transfers. Training before the test, not the other way around. Yes, it will be expensive, but if Canada can commit to spending 5% of its GDP on defense, it can certainly invest some of that money to ensure that its military personnel, both Francophone and Anglophone, as well as their families, can serve with competence, confidence, and dignity in both of this country's official languages. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Sauvé. We will now start our first round of questions. Monsieur Pierre-Paul Housse, you have up to 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci aux témoins d'être ici aujourd'hui.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for being here with us today. 39 years ago today, I enrolled in the Canadian Armed Forces. And I think it's important to talk about how different the work environment is. I mean, I was in the 5th Brigade, Valcartier. The environment was all in French, but it became complicated when we were posted outside of Quebec, and where there were promotions, it not being in Quebec for somebody like me who speaks French. So for members of the Canadian Armed Forces who speak French or who are outside of Quebec, that's where it's complicated. Ms. Chouinard, you said that the real problem is the lack of language training. In my day, there were month-long training sessions that existed. And do you know what the situation is today? Answer. The training courses still exist. There are some challenges with regard to the timing of when those courses are given. So it's not at the beginning of people's career in the military. It's when it becomes necessary for them to get a promotion. That's when they're sent for training. That delays their career progression. And it also can create some resentment as well. So the courses themselves are geared toward passing the exams. They're not geared toward really using the language on a day-to-day basis with other members of the team. And that, to me, is the crux of the issue, because it's one thing to be able to have on your file that you took the course, and then the other, really what matters, is to be able to carry out day-to-day activities. So what you're saying is very important, because the type of language training is not, in fact, adapted to the reality of the workplace, and to be able to have conversations, for example. Because right now what it is the training is more rote learning and filling out forms or filling out things. Yeah, it's the check in the box. Yeah, so I think that's important to take into account. That's an important point. I'll go quickly because I don't have a lot of time for questions. General Maisonneuve, I'd like to ask you some operational questions. So I remember that when we were posted abroad, leaving Canada, the use of language. So when we have officers who are Quebecers, who are Francophones, and who have to do their work in English, have you seen situations where lack of English can be a security issue? Answer. Yes. And in fact, when I was trained, courses were only given in English. We lost a lot of excellent leaders who did not manage to learn English. So to me, it's absolutely essential for operational needs. On a mission outside of Canada, for example, English or French will make it possible for us to communicate with the people in the country where we are serving. And it's very important. But to come back to what Ms. Chouinard was saying, I completely support everything that she said and what Hélène said as well. And I would say that there's also a lack of capacity. And of course, there are far more English speakers who have to learn French, so we need far more language courses, because Francophones generally learn in action as they're working, but the Anglophones also need a lot of language courses. Thank you. So when it comes to language training, that's one thing. But what about the different capacities? We have the Army, Navy, and Air Forces. So what I was saying earlier is that rather than if you're not deployed elsewhere for certain tasks for the Army, that's one thing. But my son is in the Navy, and he was in Esquimalt or Halifax. It was only in English. He didn't have a chance, and he told me if I didn't understand English, I could not go there. Does that make sense? That young people in the reserve to have that situation apply to them, to be sent somewhere where they can't speak French at all? They have no chance to speak French? Answer. So, yes, we have the situation in Quebec where the armed forces operate in French, but then we have 3 divisions. There's the regular armed forces members, there's reserve, and then there's support services. So you can have people from all over the country. So how is it going to work in those barracks where people around the table, you have people in the reserve who are unilingual Anglophones, unilingual Francophones, or bilingual? I mean, generally what happens is that there's a sort of a ballast effect where English becomes the language of work. So I am afraid that at some point in the Army, and that's what I know best, throughout the divisions, it'll be absolutely necessary to be bilingual because it'll be necessary to work all over Canada. And I'm not sure that in Western Canada and Central Canada, the requirement will be to speak French in those meetings as well, because there will still be armed forces in Quebec, but that is led by commanders who are Anglophone or bilingual. I'd like to add something, if I may, Mr. Paulus. Yes, so the Navy and the Air Force also have different approaches. And so when I visited the MCSM in Quebec City and the NCSM in Canada, or Ottawa rather, there were a number of English speakers, and generally the language of work was English. In Bagotville, I think you'd see that there are also an awful lot of English speakers, and often the language of work is English. Thank you. So just to conclude, Mr. Chair, the point that Mr. Sauvé stated, redefining the Canadian territory with 3 divisions. The 2nd division will be closed in Quebec. That's going to have a major impact on Francophones who work in the Canadian Armed Forces. Thank you. Thank you very much.
6 minutes.
6 minutes. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Puis,
Thank you, Chair. I am very glad to hear, General Maisonneuve, that you think that Anglophones can be the best defenders of the French language. I would say that I'm a poster child of an English speaker who learned French. I was very lucky to have my parents send me to French school from a very young age, and I thank them every day for the gift they gave me. And I think that it is a gift that we are giving to the members of the Canadian Armed Forces to be able to express themselves in both languages. So I'd like to start with that. But I'd like to hear a little bit more about your personal experiences, those of you who have served. Mr. Sauvé, did you suffer discrimination because of the language you spoke within your service? And if so, did it have an impact on your career? Answer. As I mentioned, I started in the infantry in the 22nd Division, and I started in French, I continued in French, and then I went to intelligence, and intelligence was unilingual Anglophone. It's because we work with the 5 Eyes, so England, the United States, New Zealand, and Australia. So I understand the need to operate in English. I never questioned it because when it comes to intelligence, well, if I write a report, I want it to be read by the Allies. But I can't say that I personally suffered discrimination. However, as I mentioned in my statement, is that really we would ask people to give testimony, and it takes more than 2 hours to hear it because there are people in the Navy who've served elsewhere who've been asked to work only in English as though it were normal. But I don't know of any examples of where an English speaker was taken and said, listen, you're going to exclusively work in French. I got an email from someone. Every day, in addition to my training, I had to understand everything I heard in English all day. When I started working in English, I mean, like everybody here, I think I would have a headache at the end of the day. The same with Spanish. I mean, sometimes it's easy to just turn that switch off and say, I've had enough. So imagine somebody who's going through training, who has to understand, who will be evaluated on their training, and then has a hard time with their evenings and their weekends because they have to spend additional time learning. And I also, the test is after training, not before. So perhaps, Ms. Lasalard, I have a question, the same question for you. Thank you very much for the question. So with regard to discrimination, I didn't experience it personally, individually, but as part of a group. So when there's a French-speaking platoon that works with an English one, we're called French frogs, that kind of thing, a number of labels. And we could see that we weren't particularly well accepted. We were told a number of times that we didn't follow the orders in the same way as others. We were always thinking outside of the box. We didn't follow instructions. So there's always that kind of comparison between English speakers and French speakers. So I think that's the kind of discrimination that I witnessed. But other than that, I think it's more in the medical services that I saw that people's careers were going far faster for my English-speaking colleagues, even though they didn't necessarily have the language profile that we needed to have in order to be able to have access to those promotions. It's a bit like accepting because you don't have a choice when it comes to career advancement. So if I'd waited, I would have had to wait another 2 years because there were no French programs available for me. So these are the compromises because we think, well, okay, if I really want to move ahead, I have to go and do it. General Maisonneuve, my friend from Saint-Jérôme, what was your experience? It's a little bit like what Hélène was saying. I did see groups because when I started my training, there were groups of people who didn't speak French who were supposed to listen to the radio and respond to orders or give orders in their second language, and they did not have the necessary knowledge to do so. That was always a very difficult thing. Something that I've seen often, and this I'm talking about acknowledging the need to have those courses available in both languages, because often people would arrive, there were about maybe 20 or so young English-speaking people and then 3 French-speaking ones. And so what are we going to do? We're going to have Franco assist because we're not going to divide the group. So what that means is that all of the classes were given in English, and then there was a bilingual French speaker who would help the French speakers who didn't speak as much English. So, I think that it's something that needs to happen, that there has to be training for Francophones. It'll cost something. It's not going to be cheap, but I think it's important and it's an asset for the Canadian Armed Forces. We have to dedicate the time and the resources to do that. And congratulations for learning French, Mr. Hawthorne. It's wonderful. Mr. Watchorn, it's wonderful. Do I have any time left, Chair?
Soyez vite. Merci, M. Kibble. C'est très bien dit. J'aimerais savoir.
Thank you, Mr. Kibble. I will go quickly. Thank you. So for those who have served more recently, have you seen any improvements? Have there been improvements over time? Lieutenant Major Sauvé. Yes, there have been improvements. I was in military college in 1992 at Saint-Jean, and I saw people who were learning French. There was a newfie who was rooming with me, and he speaks very good French right now. But when the military college was closed in 95, I had an uncle who was transferred, and he said, well, in fact, in Kingston, the Anglophones are not bilingual. So there were improvements, yes. In some cases, there was some backsliding as well. But I think that what it is that's an issue of respecting others. I've given diversity and inclusion classes, and I don't want to start a debate on that here. But what I'm saying is that there was openness to the diversity there. We weren't necessarily treated just as all of one piece of the same language. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Watchorn.
6
Mr.
minutes.
Savard-Tremblay, 6 minutes. Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for your presentations. Ms. Lesseler, I was in the House on Monday when my friend Marie-Hélène paid tribute to you, and I would like to also pay tribute to you. And I would say that your service is much, much appreciated. And I'd like to hear about your journey, difficult, that was populated by some of the obstacles that all Francophones, and in fact all members of the armed forces, can face. But let's talk about trauma in particular. So support mechanisms, particularly in mental health, that are given to active members and to veterans, I imagine the situations are different. Are they available in both languages, and are they accessible in both languages? Because that's not the same thing as availability. Access is not the same as availability. Thank you for your question, and thank you very much for the comment that you made. So when talking about trauma, we know that in the Canadian Armed Forces, we do not have direct access to psychologists. There is, in our ranks, we don't have psychologists. We have psychiatrists, we have social workers, and so generally we have to go outside of the armed forces to get access to psychologists. So when it comes to my own experience, I got the services of a French-speaking psychologist, but the psychiatrist and the social worker who were in charge of following up, they were English speakers. And I remember I had to tell my story again and again to the psychiatrist, and I couldn't find the words to truly experience or to truly explain the experience that I had had. And I was told that I was understood, but I wonder how far I had been understood. I mean, and we were in Ottawa where there are a number of services. But when you think about French speakers who are sent to regions, who are sent to isolated posts, who do not have access to any French resources, then they're offered virtual services. And when you're not doing well, you need personal human contact, not virtual contact. So I think that there's still an awful lot of work to do when it comes to mental health in particular. I'd like to come back to a principle because Mr. Paulus was asking a question earlier, but soldiers can be in danger when it comes to language. When we were deployed in Afghanistan, we had to change our way of evacuating the injured from the field with the military hospital with a process that the Americans gave us with a 9-liner, that's called. And that all had to be done completely in English. But when you're in a battle on the ground, you don't know who is going to be affected. It could be the soldier or the corporal who does not have the ability in English to send that message out. So is that message going to be sent properly? Is the capacity there? So yes, it can put people in danger if that capacity is not present. Question. It comes back to the joke that was quite striking at the beginning of Mr. Maisonneuve's witness, is that if you don't understand something, you can really put people in danger. So I want to understand what you've said. So there are no psychologists within the Canadian Armed Forces, so you have to go outside the CAF, and so you have to go and look on Google, for example, to see where the nearest psychologist is, and then you have to make sure that there's a good insurance policy to be able to pay those services. But you said that you have access to a psychiatrist within the CAF, but the psychiatrist did not speak French. So the resource within the forces was not able to provide services in French? Exactly. That's it. And I asked whether it was possible to have services in French, and I was told, well, the waiting list is very long, and we don't necessarily have psychiatrists who speak French here. So what do you want to do? So my decision had to be, well, what do I do? Do I continue to try to do as best I can with the Anglophone resource or take risks? Question. So really, psychiatrists are not like psychologists. They don't generally have private practice where you can go and see them, but perhaps was there any kind of partnership with hospitals or clinics? Perhaps there was no other way of doing it? Answer, no, there wasn't. And you can see that sometimes at hospitals. People might have an interpreter with them or a resource that will make it possible to have assistance for someone who speaks French or English, but none of that was proposed to me. It's really, you had to just try to get services yourself, and that's what I did. And with my psychologist's help, well, she was able to send more specific requests to my English-speaking psychiatrists. I will turn to the others who've served in the forces. Does this sound like something that you have heard about or perhaps even experienced? Answer. Well, thank you very much for the question, because there are not enough mental health services in the Canadian Armed Forces, period. When I left the forces, I had a number of mental health problems, anxiety, depression, and I was hiding that in a major way. And I think that when I left, it opened the floodgates for me. And I think that 40% of people in the Canadian Armed Forces deal with mental health issues. And I think that it can go even as high as 90%. It's something that's hidden. It's a taboo. And people are professionals. They continue to function as well as they can, and they find the services that they can. I personally had 5 psychologists and 2 psychiatrists who were not necessarily trained in what I needed based on what I had experienced. I found it very difficult, and I can tell you that what helped me was to open up, to talk about it on social media, and to talk about it with commanders, to just really say, listen, this cannot be taboo. We have to talk about it. And it did a lot of good to me, and then also did a lot of good to those who heard the testimony. Mr. Maisonneuve, so you experienced this, a long wait list that Ms. Lesser talked to us about. When it happened, I had already left the forces, and it had been a while, but I did what I ended up doing was going with my own insurance in the civilian services. But I can tell you that we train soldiers. If they are physically broken, we repair them. But if they're mentally broken, then we have to fix, quote unquote, them too. This is not something that will, because a mental health problem is not something you have to live with all your life. It's like a broken arm. It can be fixed. It can be cured. I am now very effective, but there was a time when I was not effective and I needed help. Thank you, Mr. Maisonneuve. Thank you, Mr. Sauvé. Mr. Anderson.
You came today. General Maisonneuve, I wanted to play devil's advocate just a bit here. Professor Clenard said that French should begin in BMQ and or BMOQ, I assume. BMQ is really a culture change. It's taking young adults who have spent a couple decades in the civilian world and turning them into soldiers. And I'm wondering if, in your view, BMQ is the best place to start language training, to adding that task to the culture shock that they're enduring.
I don't think so, and I don't think that's what Professor Chouinard, and we should ask her what she really meant by that. But I think what we're talking about here is providing the opportunity as people go up in rank. In terms of non-officers like soldiers, there's no doubt that in their career, as they move up, they're going to serve in units that are, if they're Anglophone, they're going to go usually to an Anglophone unit, and same with Francophones, they'll go to a Francophone unit like Major Sauvé did. However, there are, as they grow up in rank, as they get to the sergeant and warrant officer, they might be, going as instructors in one of the schools, or they might actually serve outside their own regiment, for example, in Ottawa. And in those cases, they do need to get and have language training earlier in their career. As I said before, I learned when I was 14, English when I was 14. I still dabble in it now because I have to. But really, the earlier you can learn it, the better it is. And so that's a great thing. And as Major Sauvé was saying, when you go to military college, even today, what we tried to do the 10 years I was in Saint-Jean, was try to put Francophone cadet with an Anglophone cadet to be roommates. That's fantastic, and I dare say all the cadets in Saint-Jean who leave Saint-Jean are usually very close to being functional, if not functional. I'm talking about Anglophones and Francophones. Francophones is not usually an issue. And I know for a fact that in Kingston, there is now a requirement, if you want to graduate and be on parade with your peers after 4 years or 5 years, if you started in Saint-Jean, you need to have passed the 4 different pillars, of which one is bilingualism. And if you haven't passed it, you get to stay back until you pass it. And that's the way it should be.
Okay. And in your view, that was the same requirement they had in grad school and University of Manitoba as well. You had to be bilingual, at least nominally. In your view, at what point during the rank progression should, first of all, the officer stream and second of all, the non-commissioned stream begin to learn French?
Okay, well, you have to understand I've been out now for quite a few years, but essentially I believe that the requirement to be functional happens at the lieutenant colonel level, or equivalent in the Navy, for officers. And I don't know what it is for non-commissioned members, but I know that there's a requirement eventually, and if they go into as chief warrant officers and they go into the higher tiers, if you wish, of chief warrant officer positions, they need to be to achieve their functional ability. What's very interesting is you look at the Canadian Forces general orders that come out about officers being promoted, about the general officer plot and the colonel plot, for example. You'll see very often that it's they're promoted in as interim, or I can't remember what they call it now, but it's not a substantive promotion. Very often, the reason why they're not substantive is that they have not passed their functional level in bilingualism. And I think functional is actually not very difficult to get to. You just need to work hard and you can get to it. The next level is integral, which is more difficult. But I believe, if you're going to be a general officer in our Canadian Armed Forces, you ought to be integral in both languages.
Okay, my question is really at what point in the training, early in the qualifications, after BMQ, or at what point do you suggest you begin to force people to learn languages?
Well, as an officer, immediately. As a non-commissioned officer, as a private, corporal, etc., I believe there's really no need, unless you have a need to go into if you're a francophone, you're going to an English language unit, obviously, you should get the training before you get there. But usually what happens at the lower levels, like private, corporal, you end up going to a unit of your own language, if you wish. So the requirement's only there to me to be like master corporal, sergeant, when you get to a point where you're going to be teaching, for example, at the recruit school or at the one of your trade schools, etc.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Clenard, I should ask you, is that what you meant?
Yeah, I agree with Monsieur Maisonneuve. I don't think BMQ is necessarily the proper timing for soldiers coming in, but if they have any ambition to leave their unit and to go elsewhere, then they should know that they're going to need that proficiency in their second official language, and that should be provided much earlier on than it is at this point.
Okay, and Major Sauvé, do you agree with the assessment as to when both non-commissioned and officer stream should begin training?
Oui, certainement. Quand on rentre au collège, il y a 4 piliers.
Certainly, when you enter the military college, there are 4 pillars, and one of them is bilingualism, but usually you let someone study for 4 or 5 years before they're bilingual. It's the same thing for the physical pillar. If you need to build up your strength, you give them help and you let them train. Now, when people arrive at Saint-Jean, it can be a shock. They have a lot to learn. But being aware of how things are done, it's not a test. But telling them you will be meeting Francophone troops, you will be meeting Anglophone troops, you can get familiarized with the language without necessarily having to pass any tests.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson, we're done. Monsieur Sauvé, Madame Lapointe, over 5 minutes.
Ms. Lapointe, 5 minutes. Microphone, please. Professor Chouinard, given the specific context of the Canadian Armed Forces, what do you think the most important strategic elements are to guarantee official language obligations within daily military operations, including the formations and operations in general? Since I'm the only one of the 4 witnesses who hasn't served, I will refrain from answering that part of the question. But when it comes to training, obviously, for officers, what's already done at both military colleges is what is necessary. As a professor, for someone who's trying to do research in this area, there's very little research that has already been done, which means it's very difficult to access data. For example, for people who are working toward becoming commissioned officers, who are going to university and who do their military training on the weekends, for example, because obviously not everyone comes out of Kingston and Saint-Jean. Would those people have more comfort or less with language training? That's the kind of question that we can't answer when we look for more information. So there's a lack of basic data. Thank you. Are there other witnesses who'd like to respond to the question? I would like to answer the question. Thank you for the question. Concerning training, I served in contexts where there were support professions, professionals who had to function at a different level. So not only at the unit, but sometimes in the brigade or at a divisional unit. And often you have to work bilingually. So when you look at professions that are not combat professions, we're talking about administration, mechanics, radio operation, all of those supportive professions, medicine, etc. All of that happens in a bilingual context. So it would be wrong to say that non-commissioned officers shouldn't have bilingualism from the outset. I think you should look at the type of job that people are going to do to determine the needs in terms of language and language training. Thank you. Professor Chouinard, when you study the progress made in terms of bilingualism in an institution such as the Armed Forces, what kind of factors do we have to look at to determine whether changes have any real impact? Are you asking me on an individual basis? More on a systemic basis. On an individual basis, I can't answer that because I'm not a linguist, but from a systemic standpoint, what we look at is percentages, the percentage of members who meet the criteria. So do they have a CBC or BBB grade? And when we do surveys with members of the forces, and we ask, for example, are you comfortable speaking the official language of your source, of the official language of your choice with your superior officers in your daily life? That becomes a specific issue. There are also the questions around mental health, which might come into play. It's important to also think about the families of members of the armed forces, where family members may find themselves in parts of the country where they do not speak the majority language, and that can play a role. So we have to look at several different factors to see if there's any improvement, and it starts with asking questions. Mr. Sauvé, what do you think are the factors that guarantee a uniform application of the support measures for Francophone members in all units? And what are the major shortfalls in your opinion? As I said in my opening remarks, training is important. If you give me a tool like Excel and you expect me to use it perfectly with no training, then I might be able to do something very basic, but that will be it. It's the same thing for language. You have to give someone the tools not only to speak a language, but to feel confident. So, one thing I wanted to mention is that it's difficult to make complaints within the armed forces. It's difficult to question things. I already heard someone say, trying to understand is trying to disobey. So when you ask why something is the way it is, it makes you stand out. And that's the last thing you want to do. You want to stay anonymous. And so people don't have a tendency to make complaints or ask questions. So if you really want to know what's happening, you have to do 360-degree assessments. You have to go not only at the top, but to the very bottom. And then you can tell a commander, well, you might consider that your unit is bilingual, but the results from the ground don't tell us that that is not the case. So having one-on-one interviews and asking if someone is comfortable speaking both languages, that will give you some information.
Monsieur Savard-Tremblay, over to you.
Merci.
Mr. Savard-Tremblay, I have a question for Mr. Sauvé. I can't remember the term that you used earlier. I think you were talking about hierarchy, but within the forces there's a hierarchical structure. Does that have a chilling effect when it comes to complaints? Of course, people, in this case we're talking about linguistic rights, but there are other rights out there too. Well, hierarchy is very important in the Canadian Armed Forces. Someone has to give the orders. But there are some places where when a hierarchy is very rigid, the people at the very bottom aren't necessarily listened to. And so when people feel abandoned, well, they want to pass their courses. There's nothing worse than doing a class and coming back having failed that class. So we come home and we look up terms that we didn't understand in English, but the last thing that we'll do is start questioning the system to then end up being the one person standing out and seeming to cause problems. I'd like to add something. Yes, go ahead. You're right. The Canadian Armed Forces is a hierarchical organization for good reason. But hierarchy doesn't mean you don't listen. In fact, the best people are those who listen, not only to the people immediately beneath them, but to people who are truly on the ground. So it's an issue of leadership. Earlier on, there was a discussion about indicators. And there's a question of availability of classes and opportunities to practice. Often the government tries things out in the Canadian Armed Forces. And, for example, it was noted that when there were more exchanges, for example, having Francophones serve in non-Francophone regions and vice versa, there were a lot of Anglophones who went to Valcartier, for example, and who left perfectly bilingual. I think that's something that should be done much more, but often it's difficult to convince people to move their entire families to a different part of the country. It's one thing to study a language, but it's another thing to pick up your whole family and bring them there. If I can add something, when I did my training in my second language, I said to myself, I can't let things continue this way. I used the system via the Armed Forces Ombudsman to make a complaint so that things would change. Work was done, and Ryerson University, that had the contract at the time for providing classes, realized that they were not able to deliver bilingual classes, and so the contract was canceled. I think people don't use that tool of the Ombudsman enough. Thank you.
Ms. Gallant, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To Ms. Le Saleur, you were a witness for this committee study on C11 last year, and tomorrow the bill will be moving to report stage in the House, where the government has undone several amendments from witnesses with the Speaker's ruling. Given your experience that you mentioned in your testimony today, if all these amendments that were removed thus far go forth, do you still believe that C11 in its form without the recommendations
Point of
would
order.
still be flawed, given what you
Point of
told
order.
us here today?
Just a moment, Ms. Millet. Point of order, Ms. Romanado.
Thank you, Chair. We're doing a study on Francophone and Indigenous members of the Canadian Armed Forces. So the relevance of the question from the member opposite is not related to this study. And given the importance of the experience of members of the Canadian Armed Forces, Francophone and Indigenous, I think we should stick to the topic we have before us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Romanado. Yes, Mr. Prezant.
I believe, though, that during opening statements that Ms. Le Saleur has said that, you know, she experienced after her trauma in the CAF or PTSD, that she lacked services in French, and so I think it is relevant.
Just a moment there. This is not a point of order, I don't believe, but it's, if it's relevant, it's been brought forward. Any further debate on this issue? Let's try to keep it to the point at hand. Thank you. Over to Ms. Gallant. It's your time.
So based on your experiences that you had with the PTSD and being denied really treatment in French for your trauma, as this bill changed, do you feel that the changes that were taken out based on the recommendations would in any way impact the treatment you should have received?
Thank you for the question. I will be really honest. I haven't read the new proposition that has been made, so it would be really hard for me to express what I think about this. But I still believe that we should have a choice. And it's exactly what I was saying when we're talking about accessing services for mental health. It always should be a choice of the member to be in French if it's desired, or if it's okay to be in English, but not to impose a service in a second language if the person is not capable to do so.
Okay, and you made the mention of being in choice. Now, if this bill goes forth, it will go to the civilian system, and there may be language impediments. There may not be the interpretation necessarily, or it may be delayed. And then we have the Jordan principle, which could deny you or deny victims the chance to have their case in court at all. So with that in mind, do you believe that we should have the amendment stay? It's still there right now, giving the victims choice in whether or not they want to go through the civilian system or the military system?
The choice is important because as a member of First Nation, for example, I need to recognize my culture. And the military culture is really unique. And going into the civilian world, my fear is that at some point there's going to be a lack of understanding of this culture to really grasp the experience the person went through. So that's why for me, choice is meaning also respecting the culture where the person is coming from. And culture, Francophone culture and Anglophone culture is also different.
When you were in Afghanistan, were there any other issues besides the trauma where you found it difficult being deployed and not having everyone who spoke your official language, who should have been?
I'm lucky because I was able to receive the training and develop my capacity in my second language. So I did not necessarily face any problem when I was in Afghanistan. I think I was well prepared, but it's mostly my subordinates who suffered that lack of training or that lack of practice because they were in Valcartier, Quebec, so they were always speaking in French mostly. But when you're starting an operation where everything is done in English, when you're not practicing, it's really hard. So I saw them struggling at some moments for that.
And when you first reported the incident that brought you through the trauma, when you first reported it, did you have the opportunity to report it in your first language?
So, as I said when I testified previously, I did not report the sexual misconduct. It was a choice of not reporting because it was a person directly commanding my chain of command. It was a brigade commander. So for me, it wasn't possible to make this report. So my trauma is related not to military sexual trauma, is related to the fact that my vehicle exploded on an ID in Afghanistan, which is different.
Okay, and anybody that was with you at that time, were you able to talk to them about that in your first language?
Yes, because my unit was mostly Francophone, and I would say my boss, which was a physician, was a Francophone too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Monsieur Mallet, over to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And unlike my colleague who was fortunate to learn French at an early age, I did not have that, despite the fact my French-Canadian father was very much fluent. It was his first language, but my Polish mother had other ideas. So I'm unilingual and I'm getting there. I will be this time next year. I will be conversing in French. But my question is for Professor Chouinard. As I frequently mention here, I'm proudly representative of the Bay of Quinte riding, which houses 8 wings CFB Trenton. But I know from conversations and observations in that area, and I've spent almost 40 years in that area. It's a largely Anglo area, as are probably 2/3 at least or better of our bases. And I do see a lot of largely unilingual and CAF members and their families quite often struggling to communicate and assimilate into the communities in these areas. So my question to you, and I guess perhaps Monsieur Sauvé, what would you suggest we could do to better help in this transition, to better support Francophone CAF members and their families, whether on base or not?
Thank you for the question. I think one of the main things is to make sure that the families that are moving in those circumstances with the member have access to all the services that they need. The family services that the CAF provides in the language of their choice, and that includes information about things that the family will need that the CAF does not provide. For example, schooling, which is, comes pretty much first in line when you're moving your family and you have kids. Where is the closest French school to the base? virtually all of them, except for, I think, Gander, have French elementary and secondary schools nearby. Obviously, that's not the responsibility of the CAF, but to have that information available for the families, I think, is something that would be tremendously helpful. And to foster those community ties with similar people who are in similar circumstances, I think, would be helpful as well.
Monsieur Sauvé, any observations?
Oui, ben, merci pour votre question sur les familles.
Yes, thank you for your question on family. Because family is a team in defense. My wife chose me, didn't choose the military, but I was in the military and she had to live with the consequences. I was in Afghanistan for 9 months. We had a 3-year-old, a 1-year-old, and she was pregnant. There was 4.5 meters of snow in Quebec that year. So the person who suffered the most during those 9 months was her, not me. In addition, we were transferred to Ottawa and to Washington, D.C. My wife had to learn English. She had to find a job in English. My children had to learn English as well. And one of the reasons that I left the military is because I had 4 children. And the transfers moving around became very difficult for them. So I think that the least we can do is to provide service to them in their language. That means that it should go through the family centers, which is a beautiful initiative, and it's up to them to tell people where the services are, where they exist, and often the families that have the hardest time adapting, and it happened in Valcartier as well, for English-speaking families who had difficulty there. I can say, as a supervisor, when I have a subordinate who is having a hard time at home, I can feel it, and it is up to me to help them. And if I can't help them, it might be better to send them elsewhere. When the family is having a hard time, because families are truly a team, because members of the military need their spouses, and they also need their children to be able to follow that. I mean, there's a lot of people who, like my situation, where the 9, 10-year-olds, the children who are 9 and 10 don't want to leave their friends. They don't want to start all over again. They don't want to have to study in another language. And so it has an impact on the effectiveness of defense because people leave the armed forces for those reasons.
Merci.
Time to the thoroughly bilingual Mr. Watchorn.
Merci, Monsieur Mallette. J'ai une petite question pour. Ça peut être pour tout le monde.
Thank you very much. I have a question for any of you. We were talking about a change of cultures, and we've been studying this for about 11 months rather. We're talking about a change of culture. So we have General Carignan. She is a French speaker. And do you think that it will give a positive example and help with this change of culture, since she is the Chief of Defense Staff? Yes, well, as Mr. Sauvé said, the example comes from the top. And when it comes to bilingualism, when Anglophones give the example, it's often more far-reaching. And, for example, Jeremy Hansen, who was from the Kingston Royal Military College. I'm tooting my own horn here. I've got to make hay while the sun shines, as they say. And he is a demonstration of bilingualism, and it came from his training as an officer at the Kingston Royal Military College. So to have examples like Ms. Carignan, of course, but also examples of English speakers who won't be sent to the Académie Française, the French Academy, but who take pride in speaking French in public and who show why it's an issue of leadership and respect for them and also for the model that they project. It's important to be able to speak the other official language, and to me that is essential. And it comes from the top and it trickles down. And the rest of the hierarchy has to follow suit, of course. Thank you. Mr. Kibble, 5 minutes.
Maisonneuve,
Mr. Maisonneuve, as you kindly asked, I apologize, but I will be speaking English today. And also, I will be going to Quebec to study for a few weeks.
COE symposium, and I agree with you that bilingualism is an important factor of leadership. And I agree that this should apply at all rank levels. And you mentioned that, but do you feel that it should be every rank level that should be bilingual immediately or at some point in the training process? I know we explored this a little bit earlier.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate that I think at the officer level, it ought to start right at the beginning, and every officer should start learning his or her second language right from the get-go. And obviously, the higher you go in rank, the more bilingualism I think is required. From the NCO, non-commissioned personnel point of view, as I said, I think most personnel will serve in a unit that has its own of their own language at the beginning of their career. But as I think, as Hélène or Professor Chouinard said, you need to if you're going to be serving outside, and if you wish at some point to leave and to go on different missions or to go off teaching or in a different place in Canada, you need to start early to learn your second language. I really think this is a question of attitude. And to come back to the previous speaker and the question that was asked by Mr. Watchhorn, I've sadly seen many times in Ottawa, I've gone to meetings, very senior meetings sometimes of all deputy ministers, et cetera, where a speaker will stand up and speak strictly in English. And to me, I found that so disrespectful. And as you said very well, a couple of words in French make all the difference. The issue is acknowledging that this country is bilingual, that there are two official languages, and those languages are French and English. And so, I just find it, even in Calgary, when you're talking, a senior person is talking in Calgary, ought to say a few words in French. And that's why we have bilingual officers in the forces.
Thank you. I'm going to jump in. I want to talk a little bit. You said about meritocracy, and I agree. And you said that in the framework of French and English. Do you agree with the current policy in recruitment where recruits are no longer screened for language skills in either official language?
Well, I disagree. I think they ought to be screened, and you ought to be.
Yeah, are you aware right now we're having about 20% permanent residents who are not being screened, and who of the majority struggle speaking either official language. And in a meritocracy, you mentioned, maybe you could speak to the impact on this would have on capacity, respect, and on the institution, which you said it was very important in the framework of French and English. Would you agree also, not just both languages, but any language?
Well, I think if you're going to serve in the Canadian Armed Forces, you ought to speak French or English. I mean, it's just certainly I think that it's something that needs to happen. And I think, again, the whole kind of permanent resident thing is it's just an effort to kind of widen the pool. But to me, the reason why recruitment has not worked, I mean, we could get into it if you want, but to me, it's more of a question of, our country promoting service to country, our country promoting the honor of serving, our country making an effort to bring people in and talking about serving and the importance of having that maple leaf flag on your shoulder. It starts there, and it's got to start right at the top. So I've also heard something recently that we still have a problem of capacity of getting people through the training system. And
I just want to quickly get on to Madam Siller, and yes, you're right about getting personnel through recruiting. They've announced wonderful numbers, but those are only the people entering the system, and about 25% of them are being lost for training issues through the system. So there's a big challenge there. Madam Schiller, I just would like to thank you for sharing your story, and very quickly, if you could answer the support that you received while you were in the military, not just in theater. Could you make a quick comment on where did you get the services in English and French or French as you preferred? And then also, is that continuing on working with Veterans Affairs? I'm aware you're now a veteran, and are you able to access services in your preferred language through the Veterans Affairs process? Thank you for your service and your answer, and I think I'm out of time after that.
Merci pour la question. Yes, for sure. In the military, the moment I was in Valcartier, the time I was in Valcartier, service were available in French. It's the minute I transferred to Ottawa that was different. There was not everyone bilingual there. There was a sign of bilingualism on the counter, but they had to go search the only person in the office who was the one talking in French. But if the person was not there that day, then you had to have to speak in English. As for Veteran Affairs Canada, when you're calling case manager, when it's no longer your case manager because you're on deck, for example, the person who will respond to you is supposed to be a bilingual person. And normally I'm able to receive what I need in French. If not, I will do it in English. But we know that all services are not available for people in their first language, mostly Anglophone resources. But as I said, for an Anglophone family or person that is living in Quebec City, for example, might struggle the same way as a Francophone will struggle in an English area also. But yes, for sure, it's supposed to be bilingual, but it is on paper, not in reality.
Merci. Madame Ramelado.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I want to thank all of the witnesses who are here with us today. I have 2 sons and a daughter-in-law who all serve in the Canadian Armed Forces. They're all French speakers, and I know how hard it is to get services in both official languages on basis. It's difficult to get those services in both official languages. When my children were at the Royal Military College in Saint-Jean, they spent about half their month in English and the other half in French. So they did have the opportunity to learn both official languages with their colleagues. Ms. Chouinard, at the Royal Military College in Saint-Jean, are courses given in both official languages, or are they only given in English? You mean in the Kingston Military College? Yes, Royal Military College in Kingston, that's right. So according to the Official Languages Act, in theory, all of the programs must be offered in both official languages. Unfortunately, what we have been seeing since the opening of the Royal Military College in Saint-Jean is a dropping off of the number of Francophone students at the Royal Military College in Kingston. That means that it is harder to provide education that is of equal quality in both official languages because there are far fewer optional courses offered. And then for the mandatory courses, they have to be offered only 1 out of every 2 years because there aren't enough students there to justify a course. So, for example, you need 3 students to be able to give a course. So it shouldn't be that hard to find enough of people, but really, there has been an erosion in the number of French speakers at the Kingston Royal Military College since the opening of the college in Saint-Jean, because a number of Francophones decided to go to Saint-Jean instead of Kingston. Unfortunately, bilingualism in Kingston is one of the victims of that, de facto, because and here I'm talking about the academic side only because it's becoming more and more difficult to provide the same range of classes and the same quality of education in both official languages. And because if we don't have enough French speakers in Kingston, given what this Kingston is like, and Kingston is designated under the Ontario Bilingual Services policy and there are French speakers in Kingston, but if there are not a lot of Francophones at the college, it's hard to see how people who do go there can have practice outside or can speak French outside of the college. Mr. Sauvé, you talked about the impact on military families. So as a co-chair of Canada Sans Frontières, which is an initiative to bring together the provinces and territories with the federal government to talk about the issues that military families are facing. So during postings, for example, this is posting season. So when there are members of the family who can't find a job because their degree is not recognized in the new province, the issue of finding childcare, all of the problems linked to finding family doctor. So we're talking to our counterparts at the provincial level to see what we can do. What can we do to bring down those obstacles?
Langues officielles, c'est aussi une
The aspect of official languages can also be a barrier. I was talking to a family in Alberta, for example, a Francophone family that had trouble even doing their groceries in French. So based on your experience, what can we do better to help families? Because they live in the communities, not always on military bases. Well, you really have to think of the family as part of the team. What happens is that when we are transferred, the members of the military have access to people on the base, clerks, people who help us, but spouses and children don't have access to that. Finding a family doctor, finding classes for children, all of that is very difficult, and it's tough for families to move every 2 or 3 years. Usually spouses are very understanding, and children are too, up to a certain age, of course. But we have to give them services that are equivalent to what the members receive. Because when they arrive at a new base, they fill out the forms and all of that. But often it's the people who are left behind. You have to rebuild your network every time, find friends, and it's not always easy. Sometimes things go well, they're easy, and other times that's not the case. And that can have an impact on not only the family, but on the unit. Thank you. Yes, I can imagine that after 5 or 6 postings, families can get fed up with military life. Absolutely. I was in Valcartier, Ottawa, and Washington, but I have friends who've told me they've had 5 postings in 6 years. Finding a home, finding all the services every time. When I was posted to Washington, I had to spend about 6 months just filling out paperwork. It was almost a full-time job, and support needs to be provided to the family as well. Absolutely. Do I have any more time? Very good. Thank you. Mr. Savard-Tremblay. 3 minutes. Wow, thanks. Ms. Chouinard, I know you had to leave at 6 o'clock. Do you have time for one question? In 2018, you testified before the Senate committee with 2 recommendations, revising the Commissioner of Official Languages mandate and creating an administrative tribunal to hear cases of violations of the Official Languages Act. Would you say those 2 recommendations stand today? Well, there were 2 potential directions that reviewing the mandate of the commissioner would take. Either creating an administrative tribunal with with monetary penalties, or another route. And so the regulatory process is underway at the moment. I think either way, there was work that was done, and now we're at the stage where we have to actually get down to work. Now, do you think that all of that will help for the armed forces? Well, it's too soon to tell whether the updated Official Languages Act will actually improve things, because things are still underway. Do you think it was the right thing to do? You said there were 2 potential routes. Now, obviously, the proof is in the pudding, but, well, personally, I would have liked there to be an administrative tribunal to manage cases of recurring complaints for the same players, like Air Canada, for example, where there have been multiple complaints. But now, as you said, we'll have to see how it all plays out once everything has been tested. Okay, so a tribunal would be to hear complaints and then decide what to do. So if I were to hear a complaint, given the hierarchical culture within the armed forces, would people be too scared of going of making a complaint, even if there was an administrative tribunal? I don't understand the question. Well, I understand that it can be intimidating to lodge a complaint, but within the military culture, do you think that having an administrative tribunal that could hear complaints would be a good idea in theory but not in practice because of the culture? Well, the way we interpreted the idea of a tribunal in 2018 was for institutional cases. So it wasn't for one individual making a complaint against another person. It was really to deal with institutions. When we look at complaints related to official languages within the armed forces, the issue is that it's a very small community. And even if you make everything anonymous, it is possible to figure out who made a complaint. And then it could be seen as insubordination. There could be reprisals. As Mr. Sauvé said, there's also the fact that when you're climbing the ladder, you don't want to appear to be a troublemaker. And that, of course, might discourage a member from making a complaint. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Chouinard. Mr. Bazin.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Président. Merci au tout le monde.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for their participation here and for their service to Canada.
To follow up on Ms. Glant's questions to Madame Seclot, you had mentioned how you were denied service in French when you came back and sought treatment for PTSD. And when we look at the problems with Bill C-11, if there is a charge that happens in Canada, and say if you were on exercises and training in Western Canada, say out in Wainwright, and the charges are laid there, with Bill C-11's original intent was to, before the amendments came in, that we'll start debating tomorrow in the House, said that you would be, of course, put into the civilian courts in Alberta, which may not provide you with services in French. Do you see that as problematic? And is that one of the reasons why we need to have choice in determining which system best suits your personal needs in dealing with military sexual misconduct?
Thank you for the question. I totally agree that we should have the choice because, as I said before, when we're talking with really specific or when it's related to trauma, when it's related to sensitive issues, I don't think I would be doing it in my second language because when you're vulnerable, you don't have access to all the vocabulary that normally you would do. So I would rather have the choice to maybe choose the military way to make sure that I'm going to have services in French instead of, for example, with the example you provided, to stay in Alberta and have my case dealt with in Alberta when I'm from Quebec.
And within the military justice system, you would be given those options of whether or not you have access to both your military, like from the Judge Advocate General's office, from your victim liaison officer, you'd be able to choose someone that is proficient in French to ensure that you got the best representation possible.
Well, again, on paper, we're saying that all services are in bilingual. So I guess I would receive some service in French, but is it really the case? I'm not sure. But again, can we think about an option where in Alberta I would receive service in French? Is it something that's going to be offered to the person? I'm not sure, because is it available for one? So
Right.
it's a problem for sure.
For sure, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate your testimony today, and as well as what you did for Bill C-11 and bringing your experiences forward. So let's talk a little bit about functionality, and we know that, and this will be to General Maisonneuve, because I believe you've had a chance to look at the new Canadian Army restructuring proposed by General Michael Wright, and the inflection point 2025. And so they are going to be talking about a restructuring, a reorganization of divisions, and the reserve units in particular are all going to be under now one division and function as a Canada land force, and then we have the more expeditionary forces in a secondary division, which will include, groups like the Van Deus being a brigade, being added into overall structures along with PPCLI, the Royal Canadian Regiment, the RCRs. So how is that going to impact upon operationality? And how will that impact upon the Francophone soldiers that are serving in those units?
I believe that it can work. First of all, let's look at the regular force. The regular force, there are 3 brigades currently, one in Valcartier, Petawawa, and Edmonton. The one in Valcartier is the Francophone Brigade. Obviously, it will remain Francophone, but the point is that one commander will command all 3 brigades, and that commander obviously will need to have staff that are able to work in French and English. Everything will have to be bilingual to ensure that both the English brigades and the Francophone brigades will get their orders in the language in their language. Now, as far as the reserves go, that's a little bit more, I would say, difficult. And as Hélène said, there is a difference between Francophone soldiers and Anglophone soldiers. I mean, I've commanded both, and we could talk about what those differences are, but it has to be recognized that there are differences. And then the reserves have also got a huge cultural kind of identity. The reserves in Quebec are their own. They do their own thing, and the reserves outside. And I would say probably the reserves are probably the group that are more culturally identifiable by province. And we're talking here, I think there are 12 or 13 brigades, reserve brigades across the country. All those are going to come under one division commander, who I believe will be in Montreal. So he or she is going to have a heck of a challenge to command all those brigades, those reserve brigades. So, and again, because the division will command Francophone and Anglophone brigades and units, everything will have to be produced bilingually, certainly at that level, to get it down to the brigade, who then will, if it's a Francophone brigade, will pass on orders in that language. So it's going to have an impact, and it'll be something that has to be recognized immediately, and to ensure that the staff at the division level is able to work in either language.
So you would suggest then that we'd be moving more towards a bilingual service, especially at the leadership level, non-commissioned officer level, that those would have to be, way things are getting restructured, will really need to be, proficient in both official languages to ensure that we have that consistent delivery of service across the armed forces. Or do we look at, what they do in the Navy? The HMCS Quebec de Ville, or Ville de Quebec, is a fully Francophone frigate, and we know that the Montreal is supposed to be bilingual, and the rest of them are mainly Anglophone. Do you see? And then I guess in the Air Force, it tends to be more bilingual than probably any of the other ones. But just comments on that. When you look at the 3 different services.
My sense is actually that yes, first of all, I think at the division level there will need to be the ability in both languages, bilingual, no question, so that they can serve the brigades, the lower level, in their language. Now, you say the Navy has got a Francophone ship. My experience with the Navy is that they're the furthest behind as far as bilingualism goes, the furthest behind. I would say the Air Force is also probably quite a ways behind, but you'd have to ask the commander of the Air Force and the commander of the Navy about those questions. But I have, knowledge because, of course, I have a boy serving in the Navy. But I would say, it's important to ensure that certainly at the divisional level, it's going to be important that those folks are bilingual.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much.
Allow it so as to have a great and vibrant discussion. Monsieur Watchorn, over to you.
Merci encore, Monsieur le Président. Moi, j'aimerais revenir
Thank you again, Chair. I'd like to come back to the change in culture. We talked about General Carignan. Last week, we met the official language champions, including Major General Martin Beaujean and Geneviève Binet, who is ADM for Public Affairs. They were appointed to change the culture when it comes to official languages. I would like to know what you would tell them if you could give them some advice that would lead to the change we're looking for. I know the Major General very well. He's a close friend, and I couldn't imagine telling him what to do. He's very competent. When it comes to changing organizational structures, it's very deep-seated. It's like an iceberg, and it takes a long time to shift things. In the military world, things can change a lot faster than in other contexts. If you say people are allowed to have long hair, blue hair, or painted nails, people don't like it, but they follow orders. So there's an example of a culture that can change very rapidly. Once again, it can cause friction, but within our military culture, and I say our culture because I was in it for so long, there's great respect for the orders that come from on high. If you look at quotas for bilingualism, well, things change and culture follows. It's not the other way around. You can't change the culture first. It takes too long. You have to change the orders that are given, and then the culture changes. And I served for 22 years. I saw that the culture really changed. There was a greater openness. But I think the leadership has to lead by example. If you look at Carignan, she's not only extremely highly qualified, but she's very experienced. I have a friend in Australia. A woman is the commander of the army there. And it's important to have people like that who really deserve to be there and who show great leadership.
Ms. Le Solaire, what about you? Would you have any recommendations for the champion? Well, I think that it's actually an issue of accountability. Because there are a number of new guidelines, but to what extent do we actually examine the impact of those guidelines? So yes, it's important to make requests and also to publish data on a yearly basis to see how the careers of French speakers and English speakers differ. We could start there by evaluating what the progress is from year to year. Ms. Maisonneuve, I have that same, or Mr. Maisonneuve, I have that same question for you. So the answer I would say is that you have to kick them in the butt and be draconian. And I think it was Napoleon who said that you have to put someone in prison to encourage the rest of them. And it's a hard thing to get started. And I agree that the beauty of the Canadian Armed Forces is that you can impose something on the armed forces and the culture will change right away. It's unfortunate that they're used for experiments in that way. But that is something that does happen. So you have to have people who will walk the talk. And often that hasn't happened. Hélène was saying it. She said it a number of times. Ms. Chouinard as well said, yes, it's supposed to be like this on paper, but it's not really like that. So I think we have to start kicking people. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. Mr. Bazan?
Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am.
Yeah, we're just going to jump
Ms.
down.
Gallant.
One question each. Rapid fire.
Okay, so, yeah, so I'll be sharing my time with Mr. Anderson. To retired Lieutenant General Maisonneuve, how necessary, if at all, is it that the Canadian Rangers leaders be functional in both our official languages?
Well, now that is an interesting question. I believe it depends on what what group they're leading, and obviously, I would say in these cases probably to have some knowledge of First Nations language would be useful as well. But again, it comes out to be a question of leadership. I mean, if you obviously see in your group of, let's say the Rangers in Quebec, a lot of them are Anglophone, a lot of them are, some of them are Francophone. Obviously, they all speak their own First Nation language. So I think it behooves the leader there to have the ability to communicate with his or her subordinates. And, if you just take it from that point of view, then it's not a question that you would even be asking. You know what I'm saying? It's a leadership question. It's a respect question. It's exactly what Professor Chouinard said at the beginning and what I tried to say as well.
Scott?
Thank you very much. General, another question for you. During the Afghan deployment, about a quarter of the people who went over were actually reserves, including junior and senior officers. And I'm wondering, what's your prescription for the reserves, given that in a kinetic situation they are quite likely to supplement and be integrated into the force structure that's being projected?
Well, if you have a couple of hours, I'll talk to you about the reserves. But the first thing I would tell you is that I think the reserves are absolutely essential to our country. I believe that we're not putting enough emphasis on the reserves. I believe the problem with the reserves is the regular force, which doesn't respect the reserves as much as they should. And I have lots of prescriptions that I could provide you. But one of the things, for example, and I know that there's lots of good work being done by the commander of the Army and his staff to kind of restructure right now. But I think really the reserves are very successful when they're given the proper support by the regular force. And I'll just leave it there. For example, in terms of numbers of regular force serving among the reserves, integration of respect by the regular force of the reserves. Let's face it, in World War II and Korea, the people who went over were reservists. They were not the permanent force. And so they saved our bacon. And so we should understand that and give them the support they need.
Thank you very much, sir. I'm going to pass the rest of my time to my colleague here, Jeff Kibble.
Mr. Sauvé, you said approximately 40 is possibly as high as 90% of CF members are seeking mental health support in your statement earlier. Are you aware that recruits now are no longer screened for mental health, and what impact do you think this will have on training going forward?
Les chiffres que j'ai mentionnés, c'est des chiffres tout à fait qui viennent de moi.
The figures are figures that come from me. It's anecdotally based. It's not empirical. But my view of anxiety and depression comes from having experienced it myself, and it's not a permanent condition, because we don't say that recruit is anxious, therefore they're not going to do very well here, but it's treatable. I know it's treatable. I went through a very difficult period. I didn't think I was going to get through it, but I can tell you that I'm much better today than I ever was before.
As well, the impact, and I appreciate that this can certainly be treated, but we're sending people into recruit school that don't have mental health training. What is the impact, in your opinion, going to be? Or does that a statement about meritocracy?
I think people, if you're saying that people are not being screened at all for mental abilities, I think that's an issue. I mean, obviously, there's just a milieu here that you need to make sure that people that are coming in meet the basic standard, and the basic standard should be including being able to speak one of our two official languages and having mental capacities that allow them will allow them to progress. Otherwise, you're wasting time. You're wasting the recruiter's time and the training time.
I'm going to jump in because my colleague, Mr. Bazan, has a question. But thank you for your comment.
Thank you, Mr. Kibble. And to all witnesses, this is a study. We are going to be writing a report. So To each of you, one recommendation that you wish to make that you want to see in the report. So we'll start here in the room with Monsieur Sauvé, and then we'll go to the two online.
Comme j'ai mentionné, c'est monsieur.
As I mentioned, and Mr. Maisonneuve said this, it has to be imposed. Rules, quotas must be imposed, and then the training has to be provided, because you can't just ask everyone to be bilingual, to speak in the other language. Well, you have to give them training. And also what Mr. Maisonneuve said, that as soon as you get a position of leadership, an officer, that we ask a lot of our leaders. We ask them to be pillars in a number of areas, and also as bilingual people. So we have to start as quickly as possible.
Well, you're over time, but I do want to provide Mr. Savard-Tremblay with the last word. So we'll just, if we can give the other witnesses the opportunity to respond to that question, and Mr. Savard-Tremblay will wrap it up. So
on the recommendations?
Yes, on the recommendations. Yes. Proceed.
Yeah, General Maisonneuve, s'il vous plaît.
Yeah, I mean, I think make it an integral part of leadership, and if you do that, I think you're going to have no problems. You're going to have people that get into it and that have the right attitude about getting in there.
Yeah, so for me, it would be about equity. You know, chances should be the same for Anglophone and Francophone. Promotion, access to training, services, health services should be all about equity.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur Savard-Tremblay, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Savard-Tremblay. You have the floor. I have a single, fairly brief question. We'll see about the answers. So, Mr. Maisonneuve, there are places in the world where speaking French is an operational asset. Haiti, Nigeria, and Congo. So do you think that that asset is exploited sufficiently? I think that if everything were going very well and everyone were bilingual, it would be very useful. And I'm not just talking about serving in Haiti, where the languages are French and Creole. I'm talking about any operational position in any country, because generally you can find someone who speaks English or French as a second language. So to know a Roman language or an Anglo-Saxon language helps to understand the language in the country where someone is serving. So yes, it is definitely an operational asset to be bilingual. Is that it? Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for your service to Canada. And thank you for highlighting the value of both official languages of Canada. Very good.
Well, en portugais, c'est mieux, n'est-ce pas? Je ne parle pas français.
And I don't really speak French. I'm trying to improve it.
Our meeting. Concurrence by the members. If there's nothing more, I'll adjourn. Meeting is adjourned.